And hello, welcome you to our lunch break study here. We are blessed to have with us Rabbi Ira Stone. As you know, Rabbi Stone is going to be joining us throughout the month of Elul into the high holidays to provide us with a practice of Mussar to allow us to enter into the Yamim Noraim with a full heart and to do the necessary cheshbon hanefesh, so that we can do the teshuvah that our tradition and of course our neighborhood and our community would love for us to do. So Rabbi Stone serves as the Rosh Yeshiva of the Mussar Leadership Program at the Center for Contemporary Mussar. He has served congregations in Seattle, Washington, and in Philadelphia. I see some of his former congregants are here with us. And he was the spiritual leader at Temple Beth Zion, Beth Israel, for 27 years, where he is now the Rabbi Emeritus. He received his education at Queens College, the University of California at Santa Barbara, the AJU in Los Angeles, and at JTS, where he was ordained as a rabbi in 1979. So let me now put the spotlight here on Rabbi Stone and welcome you into our community and into our Sunday lunch discussion. Before we signed on here, Rabbi Stone was my teacher at the seminary, and he was Rabbi Russell's rabbi growing up in Philadelphia. So we have a wonderful, strong connection to Rabbi Stone here. And before we were talking a little bit about the class that I took with him, what must have been 15 years ago. And I showed him that I still have the uncorrected version of his book, which is called The Responsible Life, the Spiritual Path of Mussar. And of course, I'm just going to put the link, A Responsible Life, into our chat. And of course, he said to me I was too cheap to buy the book. So I suppose that is true. But if any of you would like to purchase this book, I'm just going to put this into the chat here. I apologize for using an Amazon link for those who are opposed to Amazon, but that was the quickest one that I could find. And I had the pleasure of studying theology with Rabbi Stone. And for the past year, since we've been doing this lunch study break, I have been bringing in professors' teachings of mine, whether it was Rabbi Neil Gilman of blessed memory, or Rabbi Norman Lamb of blessed memory, or Samson Raphael Hirsch, or Judith Plaskow. We've been bringing in thinkers who are attempting to grapple theologically with our modern world. And one of the great thinkers and professors at the seminary is Rabbi Stone. So we're privileged to have him join us here. And so what we're going to do today is I'm going to ask him some questions so that we can understand the foundation of his theology vis-a-vis Mussar. Maybe tell us a little bit about what Mussar is. And then we'll also leave some time at the end so that I know everyone here likes to ask questions, so that you'll have an opportunity to ask questions as well. So hello, Rabbi Stone. Thank you for joining us and for being a part of our community's high holiday journey. I wanted to begin with something that comes up in the first part of your book, which is, where do we find the foundation of any theological system? We've struggled over the past year with epistemological questions. How do we know what it is that God wants from us? They've been inundated with me teaching them Neil Gilman's work, which is all about, for the most part, not all about, but largely about epistemology. How do we come to know what it is that we know? And so I'm curious, can you give us the foundation for where you begin your theology? And then I'd love for you to take us out from that beginning to see how a theological framework that I've always been moved by, Mussar, can manifest itself ultimately into the practice that you're going to lead us through once Elul begins next week.
Okay, I'll do my best. Thank you, Rabbi Ira, for having me. And greetings to all of you. I'm thrilled to be here and looking forward to continuing to get to know people in your community better over the next 5 or 6 weeks as we travel along the path of probably the strangest month of Elul in most of our lives. let me begin by just um, um, framing, I guess is the right word, why theology is of interest in this context. What do we care about theology? And particularly vis-a-vis Mussar. So without trying to take too much time, Mussar is two things. It is a literature that developed primarily from about the 10th century until today, that continues, in Jewish life, which, and I'm simplifying here and I apologize, but essentially tries to connect itself to the overwhelming tradition of halacha, right? Halacha is the centerpiece of Jewish literary imagination, at least for the last 1,000 years. And along the way, the writers who created the Mussar literature wanted to make sure that halacha was contextualized and understood as a way of getting to some end. That is, halacha is not the end in itself, but rather halacha is the instrument for getting to some end. Now that end could be called righteousness, it could be called divikut, binding with the divine. I think it's most appropriately called kedusha, which we translate as holiness, but which I think fairly clearly in the biblical tradition is mostly concerned with how we treat one another. So the idea of Mussar is to make sure that halacha does not overwhelm the reason that we engage in halacha to begin with. That's number one. Number two, in the 19th century, a particular movement developed, which we call the Mussar movement, under the leadership of Rabbi Yisrael Lipkin of Salant, who essentially asked himself a rhetorical question, that if we have all this literature about how to be good and how we should treat one another, why is it so hard for us to do that? And his answer, in good 19th century style, was because human beings do not act primarily out of their conscious mind. That is, their fears, their underlying, what we would today call unconscious psychic phenomena, determine how they act in the world. And therefore, if you're going to change people's behavior, you have to break through their day-to-day consciousness and analyze how they can diffuse their fears, etc. So the Mussar movement developed a system, a practice, which had not existed for the most part for the previous 8 or 9 centuries, but which, beginning in the 19th century, became the content of the Mussar movement. And a contemporary version of that practice is precisely what we're going to be learning about in the Seeds of Mussar program that begins next week. That said, Mussar literature tends to be the most literalist, fundamentalist sounding literature of all the Jewish genres, right? In most, if not all, Mussar literature, we get a picture of a God who sees what's going on, who knows when you've been naughty and knows when you've been nice, and rewards you or punishes you accordingly. I will argue, and have argued for now 30 years, that literature, that literalist seeming literature, really masks a very deeply profound metaphorical system. And that's been in part my task and my goal to unravel. But importantly, the, the, the typical encounter with Mussar puts a contemporary Jew into a world of very literalist, fundamentalist literature. Therefore, when contemplating providing a contemporary Mussar practice, it seemed to me to be essential to accompany that practice with a map, as it were, a way of reading Mussar literature that revealed, I hope is the right word, the more profound and theology beneath the surface, and to try to put it into contemporary language. Now that gets me to the question you actually asked me, and that is that in order to construct that contemporary theology, my framework and my starting point is what I would call existential. That is, what I'm trying to suggest is that theology begins from our experience as human beings. And we take that experience and we narrativize it. We turn it into stories. Your teacher, my friend, colleague, and mentor, Rabbi Gilman, would have called that myth. I try to stay away from that word for the same reason I kept trying to get him to stay away from that word, which is that as soon as you use that word, people misunderstand you because they think you're talking about fiction. Whereas myth is really the ways in which we use language poetically to tell stories about the experiences that are real, not in the least bit fictional, in our lives. And therefore, in the beginning of this book, I try to take the three major rubrics of Jewish theology, creation, revelation, and redemption, and ground them in our felt experience of the world. Creation being, I can give you the one-liners and then I'll shut up and you can ask another question, but creation being the existential reality that we are not responsible for our own creation. No single human being brings him or herself into being. And all the stories about creation are a reflection on that reality. Revelation is equally that existential moment when every human being, even if they only experience it for a moment and then don't want to know about it, nevertheless, every human being, I think, experiences a moment when he or she realizes she is responsible for the maintenance of another person, and then go on to redemption, which we don't have to deal with right now. It would, so that's where I start. I start from the fact that in particular, for example, this question of revelation is that every human being has an experience of being nurtured, of being loved, of being indebted, of paying back that debt, and needing to assume the responsibility for another person in order to fully experience his or her own being.
Thank you, Rabbi Stone. And if you have any other electronics in your room that you could shut off the Wi-Fi, that would be great, so we can boost your signal a little bit, because sometimes the words get out of whack with your thoughts. It was really, what's interesting to me, and what I think our community has been struggling with, is I guess the classic philosophical issue of other minds. You know, how can we know that anything beyond us exists? And the danger of taking an existentialist standpoint is, at some point, if you begin from the standpoint of yourself being, you know, the only reality that you have, how do you move outwards, not only to, you know, to do the work of tikkun ha'olam, to repair the external world, but also how do we begin to get into relationship with God? And you write in your book that the theology you constructed embraces the enjoyment of pleasure as the core experience of being human. You write, we do not deny our experience of the world, but rather cherish it. in doing so, we marvel at the power that this force has in our lives. So in a certain extent, you begin with pleasure, but then you move outward into the relationship that we form with others. So I think that's a hard move. I think a lot of people have a hard time sort of externalizing God specifically. And what I really have always been compelled is, I do think to a certain extent, you might disagree with me in terms of my framing of your theology, but that what I try to provide is a relationship with God as separate from oneself. You know, one of my one-liners is, people are looking for something to believe in, preferably something other than themselves. And I'm curious, how do you get to that obligation and ultimately to the notion of halakha or mitzvah, where we find ourselves being commanded by an external commander?
Okay, so obviously it's a complicated issue. Let me go back and say again, the starting point really of all theology, at least for me, is creation, right? As soon as you recognize that absolute truth, that you are not responsible for your own being, that someone else brings you into being. On the simplest level, obviously your parents, and their parents, and their parents, and their parents, right? So that there is again, I'll use the word, and I'm not sure if I'm using it right, but the existential reality, the awakening to the fact that I am not alone. Right? That's Heschel's whole starting point, that when he says man is not alone. Well, the existential reality of not being alone is that you did not bring yourself into existence. And the support and the nurture you get from those who in fact did bring you into existence feeds the experience of pleasure, right? I feel good. And then I begin to learn that the more I can do to serve that other, right? There's nothing a child likes better than doing something that pleases his or her parent. And so my existence is not solitary, right? So the question you ask almost becomes moot, right? I experience myself in relationship from the moment I experience myself. Because I
So
there's
no solitary I. The I exists exclusively in relationship to a thou or to an other. We've studied Buber
yes.
here, so the people understand that. People will understand that reference. Then why is it so hard for people to be good? And I know that sits at the heart of Mussar, which is really following, the principle of loving your neighbor as yourself. If our existence a priori implies that someone else is responsible for us being here, for creating us, then why is it so hard for us to reciprocate that good? And why is Mussar necessary?
So this is a mystery. It's a mystery of the nature of our creation, which requires that we protect and preserve our own life, right? We have to defend our existence in a world in which we live very vulnerably, right? So we develop what our tradition calls a Yetzer Hara. That is an impulse to preserve the self. Right? You can't serve the other if you don't exist. So the relationship is not abrogated by yourself, but the relationship is supported by your having a self. And therefore, you have to have this impulse to preserve and protect yourself, right? The Yetzer Hara, which is often translated as the impulse to evil, I translate as the impulse to self-absorption. That is to say, we have a Yetzer. The Yetzer is a kind of force for self-preservation. Without a Yetzer, we don't exist. But when the Yetzer overpowers the rest of, so to speak, of who we are, then it precipitates Ra, or evil behavior. Right? Or to put it more directly, when legitimate self-need turns into self-absorption, then we are doing evil. Mussar develops as a way in which, a practice in which we can identify when we are responding to a trigger in such a way as to be overly defending ourselves against things we don't have to, therefore blocking ourselves off from our interaction with others.
Well, you're in a class with me, so sometimes my questions take us a little off topic here. So the question that I have for you now is, well, so that seems like something that really manifests itself in our current world, in which people don't want to be exposed to other ideas or other thoughts or other words even, and as a result seek to insulate themselves from those words and those thoughts that might trigger them. And you might say that that's the, I'm going to put words in your mouth and you can correct me. You might argue that that's the Yetzer Hara, that desire to create a safe space could be the overaction of the Yetzer Hara, and that we might better be served by the Yetzer HaTov, understanding what is coming at us instead of seeking to insulate ourselves from that. And I think that's a tendency we feel now in 2020. And what I've been arguing, or at least not arguing, but at least expressing to my community, is that it's this practice of Mussar that is as important in the 20s as Rabbi Lew, of blessed memory's practice of meditation and mindfulness was important in the 90s and in the beginning part of this century. Is we're moving into these isolated cubicles, these isolated spaces. We're all quite literally stuck at home. And then to figure out how to break out of that, to break out of that need to create a bubble for ourselves in which no triggers can enter into, but widen our neshama would seem to be on point. Is that, I mean, do you experience the world the same way?
Oh, the way the world is suffering from an overdeveloped Yetzer Hara could fill a book or two, or a library. You know, it's one of the trajectories of modernity was rightly, I think, to unleash the power of the individual from the overweening traditions that preceded, in which human beings didn't have the ability to act in making appropriate choices for themselves. But over the course of, let's say, 4 centuries of the modern world, we have gone further and further away from recognizing the legitimate limits on our individuality. And in America, at least, that has been has really been accelerated since the end of the Second World War. Perhaps the effort that was required by everyone in the United States to act as one society in order to win that war created a mushroom of escapism, in which the last thing anybody wanted was to have any responsibility for anything. And in the last, certainly the last 10 years, that's gotten worse and worse. So yes, I agree that in many ways, the whole idea of our Mussar program is to begin to recapture that balance between legitimate self-need and self-absorption, and to make that line clearer and clearer, and to become used to living within that balance, first on the relationships and then moving outward into our communities. I mean, I don't know that we can start out in the world. I mean, I think that that's too big a job, but we can start with our own families and our own communities, and then act in the larger community, et cetera, et cetera. But yes, the theoretical need for Mussar today is far greater than the 50s when Rav Salanter invented it.
That seems clear to me. The way that I've been explaining it homiletically is that prior to the flood, you had this completely individualistic sort of Hobbesian society in which the world was nasty, brutal, and short, and everybody was out for themselves. Then after the flood, you had the complete opposite, in which there was the complete absence of individuality. And I think my read has been that the Breshit shows these two poles and then provides the antidote, which comes in the next chapter after the Tower of Babel, which is the introduction of Avraham Avinu and the recognition that there is a God, and that finding a way to be in relationship with God can provide us with a balance that prevents us from becoming too self-absorbed, or prevents ourselves from losing our individuality when a community expresses to us that that individuality is not of value. And that's a lot of what I do as a rabbi. That pretty much sums up a lot of what I do as a rabbi. And yet, especially out here in the Bay Area, people don't necessarily like that appeal to a God, even though in my theological framework, that's the out. That when I was an attorney in a law firm, I said, I'm Shomer Shabbos. And I knew the Kadosh Baruch Hu was more powerful than my managing partner. Just couldn't say anything. It was an out. It was a way to save myself in the midst of uniformity. And so I'm wondering if you can share with us how you move from this existential understanding of having been created to an understanding that there is a creator who then places halachic demands upon.
Okay, so I'm not sure you're going to like all my answers here, Rabbi. The first thing I would say is that God is a problematic idea, and it is strongly related to the same paradigm that I was describing before. It seems to me that the brilliance of the Torah is to recognize that there is a Yud He Vav He, a source of mysterious divine or cosmic energy, which precipitates all of reality. And that for a shorthand way of talking about that God is by using the word Elohim, right, God. But in the Torah, for the most part, Adonai Eloheinu or Adonai Elohim are usually combined, so that it's very difficult to forget that the Elohim is shorthand for an Adonai that is incomprehensible. When you translate that into the English God, you get stuck with the Elohim and you lose the Yud He Vav He, which then, in my view, turns God into an idol, right? And yes.
To have a mitzvah, don't you need a mitzvah? I mean, to have a commandment, to have a halachic framework, doesn't there need to be some commander? And does that
let me get there.
Okay.
Okay. So that's number one. Number one is the mysterious, and here, of course, I'm depending a lot on later Kabbalistic theology, which I think is the majority theology of Jewish life from the 9th century onwards, but was already percolating much earlier, right? And that is the idea that the universe does not contain a being called God. The universe contains a process called God, right? I mean, we call it God because we have no better word for it, but it is an inexplicable process. There is an Ein Sof, an infinite, almost unspeakable black hole of consciousness, which then precipitates out a universe that ends up at its lowest level and its furthest level in its material form as we know it. And so that's number one in terms of God, right? Then you get the question of mitzvah. And I argue, and again, you may very well disagree, that there's only one commandment that comes from that source. And that is the commandment, V'ahavta l're'echa kamocha. That is the existential commandment. That is the moment at Sinai when we recognize that we are ultimately responsible for the other human being. Everything else is commentary, right? So one of the things that I want to be very clear to people is that I make use of the fact that I'm a conservative, not an Orthodox Jew. And for me, that means that all of what we consider halakha cannot in any way, shape, or form be attributed to the quote unquote voice of God, but rather are human beings historically conditioned trying to create a society which reflects the one existential commandment that is unarguable, v'ahavta l're'echa kamocha. And that then becomes, by the way, in terms of halachic process, how we evaluate any particular halacha in any particular period. So if a halachic position violates the notion of v'ahavta l're'echa, as I would argue, for example, the ban on homosexuality does, then it has to be overturned, right? So that is how I get there, and that's my theory.
So first of all, I adore and welcome your disagreement. I feel like this is what our movement exists for. And especially when we're talking about the bubbleization or the balkanization of our societies, my vision for this conservative community here in San Francisco is that we can be a genuine center for people of many different points of view to coalesce and to come around different perspectives and different understanding of the divine. Now, there's a question here.
Somebody wants. Oh,
yes.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Thank you, Jeremy.
So my question would be here, and for those of you who have participated in our study of Rabbi Kaplan, perhaps you recognize that this really is process theology in bits and pieces that you're describing here. It's subscribed to by Rabbi Brad Artson as well at the AJU. The idea that God is manifests itself in becoming, right? Rabbi Kaplan said God is the process that makes for salvation. And I always wanted to ask this to Kaplan, but you're about as close to Kaplan as I can get right now. So how can I be in relationship with what you refer to as an inexplicable process?
Well, I mean, the easy answer is that inexplicable process makes itself, now here's where I veer off from Kaplan into Levinas, right? So that inexplicable process leaves a trace on the face of the other person. So my service to you is the proximate arena for my service to quote unquote God, right? And that's why I'm so concerned about this God idolatry, because while some people are busy serving God out there, they're stepping over their neighbor, which is absolutely counterintuitive and certainly prohibited within my theological statement, right? The only way I can serve the infinite other is to serve the closest other and the next closest other and the next closest other. And that's why the Torah commands me to love my neighbor. It's not a mistaken word, right? To love
Okay,
that
so
person.
I mean, I hate to make a joke that comes from the Gospels, but who is your neighbor, Rabbi?
So in a sophisticated theological model, the neighbor changes, right? On one level, it's always the people who are closest to us, our family. But in any particular life situation, the neighbor could be the person closest to me in that situation. So when I go to the supermarket and there's a person who is maybe slow or handicapped in front of me in the supermarket line, and they are taking an inordinate amount of time to pay their bill, and I am getting less and less patient and more, that's my Yetzer Hara, right? I'm being more and more defensive, and eventually I'm going to just strike out either directly at that person, or when it's my turn to get to the counter, I will be unpleasant and surly to the poor cash register person, right? So in that situation, my closest other is that person that I could help. Instead of being ornery, I could grab their purse and help them, or ask them if I could help them. Or as I've seen other people do under certain circumstances, pay for them and then tell them to stand aside and pay me back, or whatever.
Stay with me there for 1 second, because I see I have 2 minutes before I'm going to open it up to questions from everybody here, and the questions are already coming in, and I'm just going to take the privilege to ask one challenging last question here. So in your answer to the who is your neighbor, right, they're very similar to the answer that Jesus puts forth in the Gospels, in which he's asked who is his neighbor. And the Kohen walks by this, decrepit Jew, or in your shopping mart scenario, someone who is having a hard time in a shopping center. And the Kohen walks by because, presumably he doesn't want to be unclean. The Levite walks by because he perhaps can't be bothered. And then the Samaritan, best understand as the Palestinian in today's framework, comes by and helps him. And the question that is understood in that way is a critique, as I understand it, of Jewish law for not providing us to be able to choose who our neighbor is. And in the theological framework you're setting up, that seems very similar to the Christian approach that's put forth by Jesus, in terms of to put the purest obligations to our neighbor in front of us, superseding over everything else. And I guess in that framework, I'm wondering, what then do we make of the Talmud? What do we make of our, corpus of laws? How do we not find ourselves in a circumstance where we say, well, if we keep kosher, we're going to embarrass this other person, so we're not going to keep kosher because L'Ahavta Recha Kamocha supersedes all of those values. And that seems to me a distinction between Judaism and Christianity. How much you?
So, yeah, first of all, I think that there is a distinction between the Talmud and the corpus of Jewish law, right? So the whole idea of creating a Judaism that is primarily defined by law, that really, in my view, is a post-Talmudic argument, or a post-Talmudic phenomenon. In the Talmud, what you have is a continuous visitation onto the relationship between the law and the ethics. And sometimes in those conversations, you're going to come down on the side of law, and sometimes you're going to come down on the side of ethics, and sometimes there's going to be more than one opinion. And I think that that direction that Rabbinic Judaism took, which was distinguished from Christianity in the sense that for Christians, the ethical, or what seems to be the ethical answer, is always the right answer. In the Talmud, sometimes the ethics are complicated, and what might be helpful in one situation isn't helpful in another situation, and therefore you have to be much more nuanced, and therefore we spend a lot of time in the Talmud trying to work those nuances out. And I think that that's ultimately the way in which Judaism tried to answer those questions, which I think ultimately in some ways got lost because the legal material overshadowed the nuanced arguments and the panoply of different opinions, right? So when the Kohen walks past the person, the idea is to ask why. Maybe there was a reason. Maybe he was, and then to take it from there, but not to abrogate the idea of law, because in fact, and this is where the Jewish proclivity really becomes very strong. Since I have an obligation that is infinite to every other person, it's impossible for me to affect that obligation. Right? Because I have an infinite obligation to you. I have an infinite obligation to art because you happen to be on my screen, Art. I have an infinite responsibility to Burton Meyer because you're also on my screen, right? So how do I judge between my infinite responsibility to the three of you? And the way in which I do that is by taking that responsibility and placing it into a social system, where if I can only serve you, then I know that someone else is serving Art and someone else is serving Bert. So I think Judaism took the notion of law as a way of, in fact, creating a larger social network in which the love, to use that expression, of the individual is mitigated through a larger social structure.
So the follow-up, Irene, you have two questions, and I'll go with your second one because it's a little more on point here. So how do you prioritize responsibility outside of family, then, is Irene's question.
Well, again, I think, unfortunately, I don't have simple answers. The answer is that it depends on the situation. If the person that I am in closest proximity at any particular moment, whose need presents itself to me, is one that I can address, right? And that's going to change. It's not going to eclipse my responsibility to my family, but my family might not be there at that moment. I'm in the supermarket. So my obligation to the other is continually traveling, as it were, to every other that I encounter.
So Don asks the question. Oh, Irene wants to follow up. Yeah.
Does that mean a hierarchical system eventually versus a emergency system versus what I'm thinking,
I think he's rejecting system, Irene. I think he's rejecting system here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that yes, I'll go that far. By rejecting system, one tries to make these decisions on an existential basis. It depends where I am and what I'm doing and what's going on.
Okay.
Thank you. Don wants to know, how do you love? So what does that even mean? And I'll take his question a step further. And what if I don't love myself?
Well, so it seems to me that the functional definition of love, and here again, we get very close to the whole idea of law. Now, the functional definition of love in the Torah is serve. How do I serve the other, right? So love is not an emotion in the Torah. Love is an obligation, right? And in part, I mean, if you remember, the V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha is essentially at the very center of the Torah, right? Numerically, it's in the middle of the book, in the middle of the chapter, in the middle of the book. I think it's off by a couple, but it's pretty close to the center of the book.
Never stopped a rabbi before. Yeah.
Right. And the holiness code in general is very much at the center of the book. And we know from some scholarship that ancient books were created from the center out. So if you think about the whole Torah, in a certain sense, from Genesis to the middle of Leviticus, you're moving toward this moment in which you understand profoundly that the whole thing is about loving your neighbor as yourself or serving your neighbor as yourself. Ki kadosh Adonai, because God is also in service, as it were, to the maintenance of the cosmos. And then everything that follows that, particularly the halacha of Tvarim and the rest of Bamidbar and Devarim, is a working out of how to serve the other. And even though it doesn't work out exactly that way, I think it's a good way to kind of think about it. Love is an ongoing process of trying to determine the best way to serve the other people that you are in contact with as a responsibility, as an obligation, right? Love is an obligation. I always give the example, and I thought my wife may be able to hear us, but I'll say it anyway, that I don't like washing dishes, right? But I wash dishes almost every night. Why? If I were living by myself, they would pile up until I would have to throw them away or spray them with a garden hose. But because I love my wife, they get washed and put away. Sometimes they have to be washed again because I'm not so good at it. But that's love, right? That's what it means.
Don, do you want to follow up? Don, do you want to follow up? I mean, you can unmute yourself if you wanted to follow up here.
No, that was that was a beautiful answer. So I guess the question would be: is it a choice when you're washing the dishes for your wife? Is that a cognitive choice, or is that just? Do you get to make that choice, or is that just something that occurs through you? Or does that make sense?
Well, I think it's a choice. Everything is a choice, right? At every moment, we are choosing between our Yetzer Hara and our Yetzer Tov. At every moment, we're choosing either to close ourselves off to the other or open ourselves up, and we do have control. That's sort of one of the other mysteries of creation, that this divine energy that maintains the entire universe. And somebody asked the source of that, and so I'll get back to that in a minute. But that divine energy devolves or mutates, as it were, into our consciousness. And we have what makes us like God, in the image of, is that choice.
Wow, thank you.
So
I see Judah has to say, go, keep going, yeah.
Well, I was just going to ask about that question of the source. And my answer here is going to be very simple and very unsatisfactory. We don't know, right? Just like we don't know why the Big Bang happened, right? You just choose your metaphor. You can call it You can call it Ein Sof, or you can call it the Big Bang. What it really means is that there's a mystery beyond which human comprehension fails. We're never going to know why the world came into being. With all the science in the world, I am sure we are never going to understand that. We're never going to know. We may get better at knowing how it evolved, but we're never going to know why or what started it, and what that means. And part of the problem with modernity is frankly just accepting that there are some things we're never going to know.
That's very unsatisfactory to the Bay Area mindset. I just have to tell you, I've learned in 2 years. Judah has his hand raised. Judah, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you. I heard you earlier this week through Beth Shalom about the Yetzer Hara, and I'd never heard that take on it before. And it so resonates with me. It makes so much sense to me. And it reminded me when I first became interested in Mussar about 15 years ago, I was coming from a 12-step background. And I really hated the idea they keep talking about character defects. And, in Mussar, you talk about midah, which are out of balance. And so that kind of what brought me over there. And I love this take today, instead of thinking of the evil inclination, as opposed to like a self-obsessed inclination. And that just works so much better for me, if I understood you correctly. And my question is, what was the word you used? I'm sorry, I missed it, which you said, I think you said you didn't like, and Rabbi Gilman used it, and you didn't like it.
The word
What?
myth. Myth. Yeah. Right.
Thank you very much.
So in scholarly circles, you can talk about the Sinai story as a myth. But when you take that out into the public, people get very unsettled, because we understand, in a popular language, we understand to mean myth, to mean fiction. Obviously, the events at Sinai are fiction in the best sense of the word, fiction that transmits truths that are otherwise impossible to transmit in any other way, right? And it's always important to be able to distinguish between the story or the myth and the truth behind the myth.
Amen. That is all the more important now. So I have about 5 more minutes. I wanted to give you some time to make a pitch for your Seeds of Mussar program. So if you're interested in this theological framework, Rabbi Stone has created a program that he's going to be bringing to our community, which is going to begin next week with the month of Elul. So how does it work? The idea is to go from self-absorption into service of others, right? So the idea is to turn your heart outward. What can people expect who sign up for your course?
So the Seeds course is a 5-week introduction to a much larger commitment that we hope some people will decide they want to make. And so what it will do is not so much go into the experience of Mussar, although there'll be a little bit of that, but really just explain the various tools and elements of the program. So for example, our program consists of a, generally speaking, weekly or bi-weekly program of 2 hours. The first hour is a text study of one of the great classics of Mussar literature with a contemporary commentary where we take some of these ideas that we've talked about today and unpack the texts so that we can read them in a contemporary key, right? Rather than be stuck with the literal sounding language. The second part of the program is called the VOD. And the VOD is a kind of venue where individuals who are doing specific work around learning to identify their Yetzer Hara, learning to become familiar with what triggers their Yetzer Hara, and learning how they can diffuse that trigger so that the Yetzer Hara does not cause their nefesh, their being, to close, thereby creating ra, or evil behavior, but rather how they can open themselves up. And the language we have for that is I mentioned the other day, is nefesh, neshama, and ruach. And so we define those terms. We don't spend a lot of time on the theological issues that we've talked about today, but we do a little bit of that because one of the key tools that we use in our program is metaphor. And so we want to really try to understand what we mean by metaphor, and how metaphor, again, doesn't mean that something is fictional, but rather means that it's expresses things that can only be expressed in literary or poetic language. We learn about preparing for class with a chavruta, and we have experience. We have a couple of weeks experience with studying in chavruta. We learn about keeping a journal, in which, on a daily basis, we set aside time to do cheshbon nefesh, which is really a real connection to the whole Elul program. In Elul, the traditional mode of behavior, as it were, is to engage in cheshbon nefesh, an accounting of our soul, of a kind of revisiting all of our behaviors during the year. Well, Mussar is like Elul on steroids. We do it all year round. And we are constantly looking for things in our behavior and in our lives that we can analyze and then redress, do better the next time. Right? So we learn about all the tools. Go on.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that came up was we learned about all the tools to prevent our Yetzer Hara, I guess, in the fight or flight framework, from putting up our dukes and battening down our hatches, right? That would be the Yetzer Hara. But then we also discussed on Monday those who might have, I guess, a deficiency of Yetzer HaTov, who perhaps don't know how to defend themselves well enough in this world. I'm wondering if that's part of the practice as well.
Oh, absolutely, right? So again, this idea of the nefesh is kind of an image of our being. And what we try to teach is that nefesh must be maintained in a semi-permeable state. If you lose your nefesh, if you lose yourself, if you become diffuse, if everybody can push you around, if you never have, you have no self-esteem, then you can't be of any service to the other. And in fact, you will generate raw behavior, even though your nefesh is far from closed, it's too far open. So we learn how to maintain a semi-permeable nefesh. So for example, if a person does a particular action and we want to determine whether that's Yetzer Hara behavior, we'll ask the question, what were you afraid of? And if in fact that fear is legitimate, if somebody was abusing you, then you should close your nefesh, and you should respond in some flight or fight reaction. But it turns out that doesn't really happen that often. So for some people, at least, it happens, and they have to learn how to restore their nefesh to semi-permeability by hardening it more. But for most of us, to be frank, it's the opposite. We have to learn to open our nefesh.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for joining us today. I think those on this call know perhaps now why I am really blessed to be able to bring Rabbi Stone here. I think this is where we are as a congregation, as Congregation Beth Shalom. We are in that middle space. We are trying to be a community that is semi-permeable, where we are balancing all sorts of different opinions, and yet we are creating that center space so that we can be together and hopefully, God willing, experience a sense of Kedusha as a community. So, Toda Rabbah. Thank you very much to Rabbi Stone. For those, I see there are more additional questions here. So if you want to send me those questions I ran, and I can send them to Rabbi Stone, or if you want to sign up for his course, I want to encourage everyone to sign up for his course. Rabbi Russell has put the link in there where you can sign up to participate in the Seeds of Mussar course. And I want to tell you, if you really love this class as I did, go tell somebody in our community that they're missing out if they don't sign up for this. I'm going to repost this video up tomorrow on social media so that other people can watch it. Let them know that this is happening here. People are looking for tangible ways and practices that they can take on during this period. So I want to encourage all of you to share this. And I look forward very much to continuing our study with Rabbi Stone. So thank you very much.